What happens when the nations of the earth unite against the chosen of God? When the kings of power, pride, and ambition conspire in shadows, can any fortress withstand the tide of their wrath? Could the coalitions of today, the whispers in palace corridors, and the roars of modern armies mirror the ancient councils that once sought to crush Israel under the weight of swords and fire? Picture a plain at dusk, the sun bleeding crimson over the horizon. Armies stretch as far as the eye can see, banners snapping in the wind, the dust of countless hooves rising like smoke from the pit of the earth itself. From the east, a host of soldiers moves with silent precision, their eyes fixed on the city that has withstood every siege, every plot, every tempest of history. Across the desert sands, from the west, another army gathers, their armor glinting under the dying sun. The air is thick with tension, as if the land itself knows that this is no ordinary confrontation. This is the gathering of nations, the assembly of the proud against the holy. Centuries ago, the prophets of Israel saw visions that pierced the veil of time. Ezekiel's scroll spoke of Gog and Magog, a coalition of many peoples rising in a single, terrible surge. Jeremiah and Zechariah warned of kings plotting destruction, yet failing to understand that the God of Israel holds the balance of nations in his hand. Even as they plotted, the earth itself seemed to tremble under the weight of unseen hands guiding the course of history. Now imagine the streets of a modern city, not far from Jerusalem. The skyline is punctuated by the gleam of towers, yet the air carries the hum of helicopters, the low rumble of armored vehicles, the silent dread of citizens who feel the tremor of distant war drums. Leaders confer in hidden rooms, maps spread before them, fingers tracing lines of attack and alliance. Ancient rivalries whisper through their plans, generations of enmity crystallized into strategy. And yet, in the midst of all this calculation, there is an unseen chess master whose hand moves pieces across the board of history without the kings and generals even realizing they are part of a divine design. The prophets' voices echo across the centuries. Nations shall rise, kingdoms shall conspire, yet the Lord's eye watches over his people. When Israel stands alone, surrounded by the roaring might of enemies, it is not merely their courage that will be tested. It is the very fulfillment of God's covenant, the living proof that history bends to the eternal. Look closely, for this is not mere speculation. The shadows of ancient coalitions stretch into today's headlines. The same nations whose ancestors once marched against Jerusalem now gather in new forms. Alliances forged in modern ambition, yet haunted by the same divine oversight. The drums of war, the clashing of ideologies, the whispers of treachery, they are all threads in a tapestry that has been weaving for millennia. This is not just history. It is prophecy unfolding before our eyes. Every coalition, every threat, every spark of conflict against Israel is a note in a song written long before kings drew their swords. The question is not whether Israel will survive, but whether the nations of the world understand that their might is under a power far greater than their own. As the dust rises and banners snap, as the horns of war sound across deserts and cities alike, one truth remains eternal. The God of Israel is not silent, and the nations that rise against his chosen shall find that their ambition cannot escape the judgment of eternity. The stage is set. The armies are gathered. The prophecy moves from scrolls of old to the heartbeat of today's world, and we, witnesses of both past and present, stand at the precipice, watching history and destiny collide in a drama written by the hand of God Himself. Long before cities rose and empires carved their borders into the earth, before the clash of armies and the thunder of chariots echoed through the valleys, the story of Israel and the nations was already being written in the heavens. It began in the sacred bloodlines of the patriarchs, in the covenant between God and Abraham, a promise that stretched across deserts, mountains, and centuries. Abraham, called from the land of Ur, heard the voice that whispered destiny over his life. I will make of you a great nation, and through you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. From that covenant, a people emerged, chosen not for power, nor for wealth, but for obedience and faith. Isaac, his son, carried the promise forward, and Jacob, wrestling in the night with the angel of the Lord, received a new name, Israel, a name that would echo through history as both a blessing and a challenge. And yet, from the same loins sprang Esau, the firstborn, whose descendants became Edom, the eternal neighbor and, in prophecy, a figure of enmity. Even within the cradle of family, the tension of nations was sown. Jacob's 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel, a living testament to God's covenant, and a spark that would ignite both devotion and jealousy in surrounding peoples. Reuben, Simeon, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin, and Levi. Each tribe a thread in a tapestry woven with divine intention, each carrying a destiny that would intertwine with the fates of kings and kingdoms yet to rise. The brothers of Israel, bound by blood, were destined to encounter the nations of the earth in ways that were both terrifying and miraculous. Beyond Israel's borders, kingdoms stirred. The land of Canaan was a crossroads of trade, culture, and conquest, a prize sought by all who hungered for power. Egypt, with its pyramids piercing the sky, held both awe and threat. Assyria, fierce and relentless, dreamed of subjugation. Babylon, rich with gold and prophecy, waited for its time to rise. Each nation would encounter Israel, not merely as neighbor to neighbor, but as a stage upon which God's purposes would unfold. Every mountain, every river, every valley became a witness to the covenant. Every clash a reminder that human ambition cannot escape divine design. The ancestors of Israel were no strangers to struggle. From Joseph, sold into slavery, to Moses, raised in Pharaoh's court yet called to deliver God's people, the narrative was marked by tension between human ambition and divine mandate. Pharaoh, proud and unyielding, laughed at the warnings of God. Yet each plague, each wave of divine justice, revealed the fragility of earthly power against eternal decree. The Red Sea itself, parting to allow Israel's escape and swallowing the chariots of the pursuers, became both literal and symbolic, a reminder that the covenant of God protects His chosen, even when the nations unite in their fury. Through conquest, exile, and return, Israel's story unfolded across the pages of history, yet always in the shadow of prophecy. The prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, spoke of coalitions yet to form, of kings yet to plot, of alliances that would arise against God's people. The rise of Amalek, the cunning of Philistines, the enmity of Moab and Edom, all were threads in a tapestry of warning and instruction. Israel's survival was never guaranteed by sword or shield. but by faithfulness to a covenant older than any empire. Even as the tribes settled into their lands, the echoes of the future were heard. Mountains, deserts, and rivers became sacred markers of covenant and conflict alike. Every border drawn by men became a stage for prophecy. Every neighboring kingdom, an actor in a divine drama that stretched across centuries. The ancient origins of Israel are not merely history. They are the blueprint of destiny, the seeds of conflict, and the herald of coalitions yet to gather against the chosen of God. In these origins, one truth is clear. From the first brotherly rivalry to the first encounter with surrounding nations, the stage was set for a story that would repeat across generations. The children of Israel, bound by covenant and blood, would face the world not only as a people, but as a symbol, a living testament that the plans of men, no matter how grand, are always subject to the will of God. And as the nations gathered then, so too would they gather again, in forms both familiar and new, echoing the eternal drama that began at the dawn of Israel's story. The desert winds carried the whispers of kings long before armies ever marched. The tribes of Israel, newly forged from the loins of Jacob, found themselves not only defining their identity, but confronting a world determined to shape them in fire and blood. The first clash was not merely of spears and shields, but of destiny against ambition, of covenant against conquest. From the plains of Moab to the highlands of Edom, the surrounding nations watched Israel with suspicion, envy, and fear. These were not strangers. They were brothers in ancestry, neighbors in geography, yet their hearts were hardened, their intentions poisoned by pride. In the days of Moses, as the Israelites wandered through the wilderness, Amalek struck. They came with sudden fury, seeking to crush the weak, to extinguish the promise before it could take root. Yet Joshua, guided by the lifting of Moses' hands and the unseen hand of God, turned the tide. Every sword thrust, every retreat, was a fulfillment of a larger plan, a clash whose significance echoed far beyond the valley. The prophets recorded these encounters not as mere history, but as warning and revelation. When Israel faced the coalition of Canaanite kings under Jericho's walls, the ground shook with the weight of divine orchestration. Trumpets sounded, stones fell, and the walls crumbled, not because of human might, but because the God of Israel commanded victory. Even when the enemies were many and cunning, God's people found deliverance in obedience and faith. These early confrontations were prophetic blueprints. Nations would rise, alliances would form, yet the outcome belonged to the Lord. King Saul confronted the Philistines, the perennial oppressors from the west, who wielded iron chariots and fear like weapons. The clash at Michmash was more than a battle. It was a test of Israel's courage under divine guidance. Jonathan's charge, small yet fearless, broke the morale of the enemy and revealed a principle repeated in prophecy. The strength of God often manifests through the seemingly weak. Time and again, Israel learned that the clash of nations was as much a spiritual confrontation as it was physical. Edom, Moab, and Ammon, each in their turn, played their parts in a prophetic drama. When Balak, king of Moab, summoned Balaam to curse Israel, the very intention of the coalition was thwarted by God's intervention. Balaam's words, though sought for destruction, became blessings. It was an unmistakable declaration. No plot, no alliance, no conspiracy could escape the sovereignty of the Almighty. The first prophetic clash was a lesson etched in history. The nations may rise against Israel with armies and schemes, but their rise is always permitted within the scope of God's plan. These confrontations, dramatic and violent, were also deeply symbolic. They were warnings to future generations, echoes of a pattern that would repeat across centuries. When Israel faced coalitions of kings, it was never merely military. They were spiritual trials, tests of faith, and affirmations of God's enduring covenant. Every enemy, whether Amalekite, Philistine, or Moabite, became a witness to the unseen battle between divine providence and human ambition. In these earliest clashes, the lesson resounds across time. The nations will unite, enemies will gather, and threats will appear overwhelming. Yet Israel, chosen and protected, stands not by strength alone, but by the hand of the God who controls history. These first confrontations were not just events of the past. They were prophetic mirrors, revealing the eternal truth that the gathering of nations against God's people is both foretold and limited by His sovereign will. The first prophetic clash set the stage for a recurring drama. Israel surrounded, the nations in coalition, and the God of heaven, orchestrating the outcome from the heights. It was a clash of bloodlines, of ambition, of divine destiny, and the echoes of these battles would reverberate into the modern age, where ancient patterns take new shapes, alliances form anew, and the prophecy of nations rising against Israel continues to unfold. The horizon darkened with the shadows of empires yet to claim their place in history. From the sands of Mesopotamia to the banks of the Nile, the earth trembled under kings who sought dominion over all. Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, Persia, names that would echo through the corridors of prophecy, rose not by chance, but as instruments in a divine narrative, their strength tempered by the unseen hand of God. Assyria, ruthless and relentless, first carved a path of terror through the north. Its chariots of iron, its armies disciplined and cruel, brought fear to Israel and Judah alike. The prophets of old cried out against them, "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger." Yet within the terror lay purpose. Assyria was permitted to strike, to discipline, and to test, revealing both the pride of men and the faith of God's people. Every city sacked, every family displaced, every throne toppled was a note in a symphony orchestrated from heaven. Babylon followed, a golden empire shimmering with wealth and ambition. Nebuchadnezzar, proud and godless, marched against Jerusalem, his armies encircling the city of David with iron and flame. The siege, the exile, the destruction of the temple, all were foretold by the prophets, each act a fulfillment of God's warning and mercy. Daniel, in the courts of Babylon, interpreted dreams and visions, revealing the rise and fall of kingdoms as the eternal will of God unfolded. The handwriting on the wall was more than a warning to kings. It was a declaration that earthly power, no matter how grand, submits to the decree of heaven. Egypt, the ancient power of the Nile, never truly faded from history. Its wealth, its wisdom, its armies became both an allure and a threat to Israel. Time and again, pharaohs rose to challenge God's chosen, from the slavery of Joseph's brethren to the rebellion of neighboring kings. And yet, even in their might, they too were instruments of a greater plan, shadows moving across the stage that God had set. The lessons of Egypt, pride, oppression, eventual collapse, served as reminders to all nations that divine authority surpasses human ambition. Persia entered the stage. Like a dawn after the storm, Cyrus the Great, anointed though unaware of it, permitted the exiles to return to Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple and restoring the covenant's witness. The empire of Persia became a paradox. a world power wielding authority over nations, yet unknowingly executing God's will. Prophecy intertwined with history, teaching that empires, whether cruel or benevolent, are ultimately under the sovereign hand of the Almighty. The prophets Ezekiel and Daniel chronicled visions that transcended time. Ezekiel's wheels within wheels, the dry bones rising in vision, spoke of resurrection and judgment, of nations gathering and scattering according to divine purpose. Daniel's visions of beasts, horns, and kingdoms revealed that the succession of empires, each mighty, each terrifying, was but a fleeting shadow in the eternity of God's plan. Were these empires merely tools in God's hand, their ambition harnessed to a higher destiny? Or were they actors blinded by pride, marching toward ruin without realizing they fulfilled prophecy with every conquest? From Assyria's terror to Babylon's splendor, Egypt's persistence, and Persia's paradox, the rise of empires was never random. Each power, each alliance, each coalition against Israel was both a warning and a revelation that the nations of the world, in their pride and ambition, are constrained by the will of the Almighty. History itself became prophecy in motion, a record written not only in scrolls and stone, but in the movements of kings and armies, in the rise and fall of thrones, in the covenant that God had sworn to His people. Even now, as modern powers rise and alliances form, the echoes of these ancient empires resonate. Their stories remind us that human ambition, no matter how grand, cannot escape divine orchestration. The rise of empires, with all their terror, glory, and power, was never the end. It was the prelude to a larger battle, one that continues to shape the nations that rise against Israel. The question remains, haunting and persistent: were these empires merely tools in God's hand? Or did they ever truly know whose purpose they were fulfilling? The prophets of Israel spoke not merely to comfort, nor merely to condemn. They spoke with the authority of heaven, voices that pierced the veil of time to warn nations, kings, and empires alike. From Isaiah to Jeremiah, from Ezekiel to Zechariah, the words were precise, vivid, and unyielding. The nations that rise against God's people will face judgment, yet Israel's path will always be under divine protection. Isaiah, in tones of fire and thunder, declared, "Behold, the nations are as a drop of a bucket, and are counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, he taketh up the isles as a very little thing." Isaiah 40:15. To the kingdoms of the earth, there was a warning in every syllable. Pride may swell, armies may gather, alliances may form, but against the will of the Almighty, all power is transient. The prophet's eyes saw beyond the immediate threat, beyond the gathering of kings against Israel, into a cosmic drama where the arrogance of rulers would be humbled by divine decree. Jeremiah's prophecies rang with urgency. "For lo, I will command, and I will sift the nations, and all their enemies shall be broken." Jeremiah 25:9. Babylon, Assyria, Persia, all had faced this sifting, and yet future coalitions, even in modern guise, would rise. The warning was not merely historical, it was eternal. Every nation plotting against Israel, whether with armies, diplomacy, or deceit, is part of a pattern foreseen millennia ago. The scribes of heaven inscribed these warnings as signposts for those who would dare to ignore God's sovereignty. Ezekiel's visions added depth and terror to the prophetic warnings. In Ezekiel 38 and 39, the prophetic oracle against Gog and Magog describes a coalition that would come from the north, a vast assembly of nations intent on consuming the land of Israel. The imagery is apocalyptic: fire and brimstone, mountains trembling, weapons consumed by divine intervention. These words were not metaphor alone. They were warnings etched in the scrolls of eternity, a message that the nations that gather against Israel will be scattered, their plans undone by the Almighty. Even Zechariah, whose visions often shimmered with hope, brought cautionary counsel. "Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about." Zechariah 12:2. The world's envy, its desire to subdue and control, is reflected in prophecy as a testing ground. Nations will rise, leaders will conspire, and yet every assault carries the fingerprint of God, who permits the threat to reveal faith, character, and the enduring covenant. These prophetic warnings are not merely echoes of the past. They are a lens to perceive the present. Just as ancient coalitions of kings and armies rose against Israel, modern alliances take shape in the Middle East and beyond. The warnings of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah are alive today, not only as historical records, but as living commentary on current events. The divine message is clear. The nations will gather, but Israel will endure. The coalitions will threaten, but the Almighty's protection is sovereign. Could these words be unfolding in our own time, as whispers of alliances, rhetoric of war, and the tremors of political tension spread across borders? One cannot help but see the pattern revealed in the prophets. The warnings remain as vivid and urgent as they were centuries ago. Every coalition, every plan of domination, every ambition against the chosen people is measured against divine judgment. History is prophecy in motion, and the prophecies themselves are alive, speaking to us, demanding our attention, and reminding all nations that the God of Israel governs the rise and fall of kings. The prophetic warnings stand as both shield and mirror, a shield for Israel under God's care, and a mirror for the nations, reflecting the futility of opposing the one who holds history in his hand. The ancient coalitions that marched against Israel have not vanished into dust. They have transformed, cloaked in modern alliances, modern ambitions, yet echoing the same patterns foretold by the prophets. The Middle East today is a chessboard of tension, where nations rise, fall, and conspire, and the specter of history looms over every capital, every desert, every border. Iran, a modern Persia in many ways, rallies its proxies and allies, seeking influence and control. Its rhetoric recalls the empires of old, its ambitions reminiscent of kings who believed they could dictate the fate of God's people. Hezbollah, Hamas, and other allied factions become the instruments of a coalition that the prophets might recognize as a spiritual and political echo of Gog and Magog. The missiles, the rhetoric, the military exercises, each is a drumbeat in a story written thousands of years ago, a warning repeated through centuries. Those who rise against Israel will ultimately stumble. Even beyond Iran, alliances of convenience form and dissolve with alarming speed. Arab coalitions, sometimes united in purpose, sometimes fractured by rivalry, still circle Israel like wolves. The world watches with anxiety as the rhetoric intensifies, as leaders posture, as threats of war and sanctions surge across news channels. The patterns are striking. Nations rising against Israel, alliances forming, yet every movement constrained by forces unseen, by the invisible hand of history. by the sovereignty of the Almighty. Russia's shadow stretches across the region, a modern Assyria, whose involvement in Syria, Iran, and beyond shapes the battlefield without direct conquest. Its strategies, like the ancient empires, reveal that the world's powers are entangled in a web far greater than their own designs. Even the most calculated military maneuvers and political agreements play into a larger tapestry that prophetic voices foresaw. The rise of nations, the gathering of armies, the testing of Israel's endurance. Israel itself stands at the center, not as a nation lost or passive, but as the fulcrum of prophecy. Its resilience, its strategic intelligence, its alliances with powers beyond the region, all reflect the enduring covenant, the promise that the God of Israel watches over his people. Every border skirmish, every diplomatic negotiation, every threat of coalition mirrors the ancient confrontations. Yet Israel persists, echoing the words of Isaiah and Ezekiel. Though the nations gather, the Almighty reigns. Even global politics reflects the same tension. United Nations resolutions, international sanctions, diplomatic pressure. These modern instruments resemble the ancient kings and councils that sought to curb Israel's destiny. Yet, prophecy reminds us that earthly powers, no matter how united or imposing, cannot alter the ordained plan. The rise and fall of nations, the machinations of coalitions, are all measured against a divine standard that transcends time and technology. As missiles fly, as alliances form, as rhetoric escalates across headlines, one cannot ignore the haunting truth. We are living inside prophecy right now. The ancient patterns, described in visions, oracles, and scrolls, manifest in our world with chilling precision. The nations may gather, the threats may rise, but the God of Israel has written the story, and history continues to unfold according to his sovereign plan. Beyond the headlines, beyond the armies, beyond the shifting alliances, there is a battle unseen, a war that rages in the heavens and through the hearts of men. Ephesians 6-12 declares it plainly. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Every missile, every incursion, every conspiracy is but the surface ripple of a conflict far greater, far more ancient than any map can reveal. The prophets understood this truth. When Isaiah spoke of kings gathering against Israel, when Ezekiel envisioned Gog and Magog assembling from the north, he was revealing the spiritual forces animating these nations. The visible threats, the armies, the weapons, the political coalitions, are guided in part by forces intent on opposing the covenant people of God. It is a cosmic chessboard where earthly rulers play pieces in a game controlled by unseen hands. Satan and his principalities have always sought to frustrate God's plan. They whisper lies, sow division, and ignite wars, knowing that fear and chaos can obscure faith. Yet the Almighty restrains them, as a father watches over a child, allowing threats to test Israel's endurance and to reveal the depth of his sovereignty. Every attack against Israel, every coalition of enemies, is a spiritual gauntlet, a trial designed to expose human ambition and the eternal power of God. Prayer, intercession, and vigilance are the weapons of those who perceive this hidden battle. Nations may rise and fall, missiles may strike, and strategies may fail. But the unseen forces of heaven angels of protection, the Spirit of God, the covenant promises, ensure that no plan of darkness ultimately prevails. The spiritual war is relentless, but it is also reassuring. It confirms that Israel's survival, despite the fury of its enemies, is part of a divine narrative far beyond human comprehension. The world sees only politics and strategy. The prophets, however, saw the invisible hand guiding events. The spiritual battle rages, and every modern coalition against Israel is a shadow of this eternal war. To understand the conflicts of today, one must look beyond the surface and behold the eternal struggle, the clash of darkness against light, of rebellion against covenant, of Satan's fury against the God who reigns over history itself. The horizon burns with anticipation, a stage set for the ultimate reckoning. Mountains quake, seas roar, and the sky darkens as nations gather in final defiance. Armageddon. This is not a distant myth, not a mere allegory. It is the destiny toward which history has been rushing. Israel stands at the center, the fulcrum of prophecy, as the armies of the earth assemble, like a storm ready to devour all in their path. From the north comes the gathering of forces, reminiscent of Gog and Magog, their banners raised, their weapons gleaming under the sun. To the south, the deserts echo with the march of modern coalitions, alliances forged in ambition and pride, unaware that their every step is guided within the boundaries of divine orchestration. Jerusalem trembles, not from fear alone, but from the weight of the centuries, the prayers of generations, and the promises that have withstood the test of time. Above, the heavens stir. Angels move with silent authority, unseen by the armies below. The king returns, not as a distant observer, but as the sovereign orchestrator of this final hour. The Mount of Olives becomes the epicenter of confrontation, the place where heaven intersects with earth. Lightning flashes across the skyline, as if the Almighty himself draws back the curtain on history, revealing the grand design hidden in plain sight for millennia. Every missile, every diplomatic threat, every coalition aligns with what was foretold. The nations that rise against Israel will find themselves ensnared in the divine plan, their pride shattered against the unyielding will of God. The prophetic words of Daniel, Ezekiel, and Zechariah unfold with relentless precision. The enemy gathers, but the covenant remains. The city chosen by God will not fall to human ambition. In this moment, the veil between prophecy and reality thins. The trembling hands of leaders, the uncertainty in capitals, the roar of armies, all are mere shadows of the fulfillment of God's promises. The world watches, some with awe, some with fear, as the final act begins. The king will come, the covenant will stand, and history, long foretold, will reach its apex in a moment of divine revelation and unstoppable justice. From the earliest patriarchs to the rise of empires, from the first prophetic clash to the modern coalitions circling Israel, a single thread has persisted through history: the enduring covenant of God with his chosen people. The nations may rise, alliances may form, armies may gather, yet, through every age, Israel has endured. This is not chance. This is the unfolding of a divine plan written long before the ink of history dried. The prophets spoke of Gog and Magog, of kings assembling from the north and the south. And the modern world mirrors these ancient warnings. We witness alliances shifting, rhetoric escalating, and threats multiplying. Yet Israel persists, proof that the promises of God are steadfast, immovable, and eternal. History, it seems, is a stage, and every nation plays its part, often unaware that their actions are pieces in a grand tapestry woven by divine providence. We have seen the spiritual battle that rages behind every headline, the unseen war that animates armies, fuels conflicts, and tests faith. Ephesians 6-12 reminds us that the true struggle is not merely political or military, but cosmic, a clash between the forces of light and darkness. Modern conflicts are reflections of this eternal struggle, a warning that the outcome of human schemes is never the final word. Yet amid tension and turmoil, hope shines brighter than fear. The coming fulfillment, the King's return, the culmination at the Mount of Olives, the ultimate vindication of the covenant reminds us that the God who promised will act. No coalition, no empire, no alliance can thwart what is already ordained. The prophecies of old are alive, breathing through the headlines, the deserts, the mountains, and the hearts of those who watch with eyes open to the truth. This journey through history and prophecy is more than a chronicle of events. It is an invitation to witness the ongoing story of God's sovereignty. Share this revelation, discuss it with others, and engage with the timeless truths that continue to shape our world. Subscribe, like, share, and comment to help spread these revelations, ensuring that the knowledge of prophecy, the lessons of history, and the awareness of the spiritual battle reach far and wide. And as we close this chapter, remember, the story does not end here. Nations will rise, coalitions will gather, and the drums of prophecy will beat ever louder. The next episode will take us deeper into the mysteries of God's plans, revealing hidden connections and unveiling truths that have been waiting for centuries. The stage is set. The players are in motion, and the ultimate fulfillment draws near. History and prophecy are converging, and the world is watching. Will you see what unfolds?